So there's a really interesting thing that happens when you're working on tech and policy or ethics. What it means is, well, there's actually a lot of interesting things, but what it means in part is that you are in two homogeneous fields at the exact same time, and you have to struggle to be taken seriously and listened to by both of them. And I'm pretty lucky to have worked with actually a lot of people who have broken through barriers in order to make themselves heard and make themselves successful in those fields. And a few of them are going to be on stage now speaking with you and talking about their work. And we're going to start with Jennifer Granick. Jennifer is the Surveillance and Cybersecurity Counsel with the American Civil Liberties Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. And in 2015, one of my favorite facts about Jennifer was her Black Hat keynote called Life Cycle of a Revolution, which received a ton of attention and really, I think, highlighted some of the really big issues in these fields. And I think she's going to do some of that today for all of you. Jennifer Granick.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming. And to the organizers, thanks for putting on this show. We're only just begun, and it's really been fantastic already. So last year, I wrote a book, and it's called American Spies, Modern Surveillance, Why You Should Care, and What to Do About It. And thank you. You don't have to read it, but if you could buy it, that would be great. And in the book, I wanted to try to highlight a couple of things that even experts had learned from the Edward Snowden disclosures, because it's easy for the big picture to get lost with all of the news. And there were three things that really stood out to me, even as somebody who studies this field. And the first one is that increasingly, modern surveillance is mass surveillance. We used to target people for surveillance because of their political opinions or their religion or their race, and now the mainstream is being surveilled. The second point was that secrecy is hiding this fact from the general public. And the secrecy takes two forms. One is secrecy that's part of wordplay, or games that the government plays in order to pretend that it's not doing surveillance that it is doing. And the other kind of secrecy is secrecy enforced in the law, whether it's classification or sealing of surveillance orders, secrecy that's built into the process and is legalized. And so people don't know. And then the third point was that people should care about this. And the reason people should care is because we have so many problems in this world, from poverty to racism, discrimination, environment, whatever the thing is that you really care about. That thing requires some kind of social change. There are entrenched interests that keep it the way that it is. And part of addressing that issue is to confront and to fight those entrenched interests. And surveillance makes that hard, because those people who are in power can use that information against activists in order to try to silence or neutralize us. And I want to talk today in particular about one such technique that is being used that maybe we're not paying enough attention to. And that technique is government hacking. Okay? And by government hacking, I mean, in particular, law enforcement, but also intelligence, getting access to our computers, our laptops, our phones, in order to obtain information about us. And this topic is obfuscated through the kinds of word games that we see in surveillance more generally. So you'll see people call it lawful hacking. Well, isn't that the issue, whether it's lawful or not? It's not per se lawful. You'll also see people call it extraordinary access, as if it's something that is extraordinary and wonderful, or something that is out of the ordinary and not common, when increasingly it is becoming so. And we know this because of work by great people like Citizen Lab and others who have found out that there's hacking of activists going on by Ethiopia, by Egypt, by Mexico. But we also know it because we're beginning to see your regular democratic governments trying to implement and protect the practice of government hacking in law. So the UK has government hacking as part of the Investigatory Powers Act, and is saying, this is what we're going to do. At least in the UK, they call it equipment interference, which I appreciate the honesty. In the United States, we don't have any special law. I clearly don't need this, so I'm going to put this down. In the United States, we don't have any special law that says that hacking's okay. Instead, what's happening is that we're taking the run-of-the-mill process that law enforcement uses when it does run-of-the-mill searches and pretending like that legal process is enough to authorize hacks into people's computers. And so what we've seen in the history of government hacking is some pretty fun stories. One of the earliest cases of government hacking involved involved breaking into somebody's house and then installing a keylogger around their machine. But today we see government hacking in terms of sending malware distributed to all people who visit a particular website. And the most recent is in 2 child pornography cases. In one case, innocent people were infected by this malware as well. In the other case, the government tried to take more effort to try to narrow it down. And this is what we've seen, and we are likely to see more. So why do and in these cases, the government got a warrant. A warrant is very important. It's basically where the government has to go to an independent party, a judge, and say, I have good reason for doing this. This is not just random and promiscuous. There's good reason for doing this. But government hacking is different from regular searches in 5 particular ways that the warrant requirement can't really address. First is the amount and the quantity of data. What's on my computer is far more invasive than any 50 phone conversations I would have. There's the invasiveness. Part of government hacking now can include things like turning on the camera on your laptop or turning on the microphone on your smart TV, and basically converting these everyday consumer appliances into in-home surveillance machines. Then there's the problem of the falsification of data. If this information is being collected for criminal prosecution purposes, how can we know that the very act of accessing the computer hasn't changed the information that's there in ways that impinge upon the defendant's rights? And how can the defense test that theory and see that the evidence is not altered in any way if the government insists on keeping the exploit and the vulnerability secret? It interferes with the due process rights of the defendant in the criminal justice system. The fourth way is cybersecurity harms. When you have the government as an incentivized attacker on the network, that is a very different thing from having the government be on the side of defense. And that means, one, the incentives are misaligned with defense, and everybody in this room knows that defense is losing, and it's hard, and we have to work really hard and together to make it, to try to improve cybersecurity. But also there's the problem of the government losing exploits and them getting in the hands of the wrong people, as happened with WannaCry. And then there's the problem of the government hoarding vulnerabilities instead of informing the vendors or the software manufacturers that they need to fix the problem. And finally, there's the problem of public trust. In order to serve malware, we've seen the government pretend to be an Associated Press reporter, serve up child pornography for a period of 2 weeks. We've seen them try to force vendors into creating malicious software updates for their products. How can the public trust the government or trust the commercial entities, the devices, the software that we deal with every day, if this is going to be the way that the way that government hacking operates? So this amount of data, the invasiveness of the techniques, the due process problem for checking the use of this in criminal contexts, the problem of losing exploits, of hiding vulnerabilities, the problem of public trust. I mean, as lawyers, our approach to this is always to try to make rules and legislate our way out of this. But we may have some ways to deal with the privacy problem, even though it's far greater in degree than any other information that we allow the government to access with a warrant. But I really don't think that we as rulemakers, we as lawyers, have the tools that we need to deal with the invasiveness, the cybersecurity problem, the due process problem. And so here we are having this mostly secret activity going on without the rules and regulations that would be required to mitigate the downside, and without the knowledge that we need to know what to do about it. Thank you.
Next up, we have Nicole Ozer, who is the Technology and Civil Liberties Director at the American Civil Liberties Union of California. Nicole has so many accolades. I could stand up here and talk forever, but I will pick out one of my favorites, is that she was recognized by San Jose Magazine for being one of the 20 women making a mark in Silicon Valley, and I would argue probably across the country, if not the world. Let's welcome Nicole to the stage.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here today. Thanks so much to Amy for organizing us and for all of you coming to our SA today. So my colleague Jennifer did a wonderful job sort of providing an overview on surveillance and some really emerging and surreptitious issues that we're seeing in terms of government surveillance. I'm actually going to drill down on something that has been in the news a lot lately that's actually very visible, but I think that a lot of people actually don't know as much about. You pretty much would have to be under a rock if you haven't been hearing about Cambridge Analytica in the last 2 weeks. But one of the issues is that the privacy practices of Facebook and other platforms and the way that they've built the platform hasn't just lured issues related to consumer privacy at Cambridge Analytica. Actually, those same kinds of platform policies and lack of controls for information, including like names and profile photos, has actually also created an infrastructure for government surveillance. There's been sort of a widespread shopping spree related to information that's on social networking and being used for government surveillance. And back in 2009, Bruce Schneier really talked about the issue that we don't want to build an infrastructure that can also be used to facilitate a police state. In 2016, the news broke that Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram were actually being used by surveillance companies like Geophidia and Media Sonar to target activists, particularly activists of color across the country. This was widespread. We were seeing police departments from California to Colorado to Baltimore using social media surveillance tools that were taking advantage of data available through these companies' APIs. It wasn't actually an audit by Facebook or the other companies that revealed what was happening. It was actually a Public Records Act investigation by our team out here at the ACLU. We found out that there were not only systems being used in Fresno, but across the country that were surveilling activists, and particularly activists of color. This was blatant. We, in our Public Records Act investigation, found documents that companies like Media Sonar were urging police departments to target what they viewed as public safety threats. Those public safety threats were people who actually posted hashtags like Black Lives Matter, it's time for change, unarmed, let's ask questions. So this was sort of blatant what we were seeing in these documents. We were also seeing companies like Geophidia touting that its data that they could access through Facebook and Twitter and Instagram should be used to target overt threats, which they characterize to include protests, unions, and activists. Data Miner, which was another company, was actually using its access to the Twitter fire hose and its examples to its potential customers for how to use this API access was actually a student protest in South Africa. And they were also sort of highlighting how you could use the system to drill down to learn more about particular types of individuals, including both activists and journalists. So what we saw sort of happening was incredibly blatant. The ACLU, along with Color of Change and the Center for Media Justice, exposed what was happening, worked with the companies, and to their credit, companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram strengthened their developer policies and prohibited use of the API data for surveillance. But while they tightened up the surveillance policies themselves, they didn't actually address some of the underlying issues in terms of what kind of data was available through the API, or what kind of information could users themselves control. Not all of the information could be controlled. And it's these vulnerabilities in terms of what is available through the APIs and also what data is actually can users control and not control that we see the Trump administration now exploiting as well. I think most people are aware that the Trump administration is wanting to engage in systems. They've been called extreme vetting. They sort of have a different name every week, but it really is about monitoring individuals, immigrant community members, and those who they communicate with. And what this really comes down to is sort of issues that have sort of resulted from actions more than a decade ago. The Cambridge Analytica threat and what happened was something that the ACLU identified more than a decade ago. We actually produced a Facebook quiz about Facebook quizzes that identified this very threat, that if I'm friends with you, I'm friends with all the apps that you run too. This app sort of spurred some government investigations and forced Facebook to make some changes, but they never fundamentally addressed that app gap. They also, at about the same time, made some really big changes to privacy settings, including creating what was a category of publicly available information, things that users could no longer control, that there were no user controls for. And I've sort of highlighted Mark Zuckerberg's testimony last week that users have complete control over information. The fact is that's simply not true. Right now, information that is public, that you have no controls over, include things like your name, your profile picture, your networks, like your school and your workplace. And if you replace your name helps people recognize you with your name helps the government recognize you, or your networks allows others to find you more easily, and you replace it with the government can find you more easily for workplace raids, for school raids, the impact of publicly available information and having no user controls on this information has really dire consequences in terms of the current state of social and political life, particularly for vulnerable immigrant community members and activist community members. It's not hypothetical. These are actually the Q&As provided by DHS to vendors who they were seeking to bid for the extreme vetting program from this past July, where they specifically urge vendors to apply techniques to exploit publicly available information to monitor immigrant community members, and that they're trying to also develop and have found workarounds to find even more information. So the impact of not having user controls on publicly available information, or what has been deemed by companies like Facebook and others to be publicly available, has incredible ramifications. The reality is there are 2 billion plus photos that users can't control. There's 2 billion plus networks that users can't control. There's 2 billion plus names that users can't control. And for many, many years, the consumer privacy protections haven't been strong enough, but now the stakes are even higher because what the Trump administration wants to do is utilize the infrastructure from social media companies like Facebook and others to power its deportation machine. So this is why, sort of during the testimony last week, I was really harping on this issue of publicly available information and also how the defaults are set, because not having control over all of your information and having defaults set to public has massive ramifications, not just on consumer privacy, but also the actual safety of millions of users, particularly vulnerable users in the United States and abroad. So hopefully during the Q&A, we can talk about some of the work that the ACLU is doing, both on the local, state, and federal level to push back on these issues, or passing ordinances in local communities, but also just how important it is for how settings really make a difference, how company practices can really make a difference, and particularly in the current political and social climate, just how critical it is to really understand the connections between consumer privacy and government surveillance and make sure those settings are strong and that users are protected. So I'm looking forward to Q&A and talking more about this and other issues. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Ashley Tolbert, who is a software engineer turned cybersecurity engineer and researcher at Stanford University's Linear Accelerator Center. I was saying earlier in the coffee area that anybody who has NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab in their bio becomes an instant hero of mine. And Ashley is one of those people. She has a diverse background that includes researching database security at JPL, as well as modeling software for NASA Ames. Ashley?
Thank you. All right. Okay, hello everyone. So what I wanted to talk about today is the future of secure coding, specifically as it relates to emerging technologies. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So first, I want to talk about the current state of software security. I want to talk about what's stopping us from really actually throwing all of our resources into secure coding, and then why secure coding is very important right now, and then looking ahead to some of the exciting things that I think are going to make coding securely easier and more exciting in the future. This is also one of my favorite cartoons from Dilbert. So. All right, so the current state of software security. I saw an article from Fast Company that said that 2017 was the year that software bugs ate the world, which is a play on the 2011 quote by Mark Andreessen that software is eating the world. So I thought that was pretty funny. There were a lot of headlines around application security in 2017. We had the Equifax breach, where about 148 million Americans were affected, and that was a result of an unpatched struts vulnerability. We had a software defect in Singapore that actually caused a train crash. 28 people were injured from that incident. And then we had the widespread WannaCry incident that was a result of a Windows exploit. And now recently, we've had an entire city being affected by vulnerabilities, and that was Atlanta. And so I would say the software security, the state of it right now is a little questionable. So let's look at a few more industry stats. So I'll be referencing a lot of stats from this report. This is the Vericode 2017 State of Security report that they released. And there are a few striking findings in it. One is that the top 10 list of the most common vulnerabilities from 2017 and 2016 are actually very similar, which says that year by year, we're technically dealing with some of the same coding issues over and over. Another one said that 83% of organizations said that they had released code before without testing it or resolving security issues, which is not good. And another stat said that 30% of the applications that were tested passed the top 10 OAuths, the top 10 security risks that they list, which are some of the most common vulnerabilities or security risks that are listed each year. So I'd say that gives us at least a snippet of where we are as an industry. This is only 1,400 customers that they actually worked with, but it does give you an idea that software security is pretty important right now because it is the foundation of all the technologies that we have coming down the line. And then the last stat is actually from 2015. DHS released a note that said that 90% of security incidents result from exploits coming from defects in software. So that gives you a better idea of that it is a constant problem. So what's stopping us? What's stopping us from really thinking about security in our code and thinking about getting developers security training? I think it's a lack of focus on education, for one. Developers tend to receive inadequate security training or none at all, because if you have a developing team, you have a security team, it's hard to, I think, convince management to get the developers security training. And that differs from company to company, but I think it's still an issue at a lot of places that have a limited amount of resources to go around. I did my undergrad in computer science and was not required to take a security course. It was optional. And so I think security is being treated as a complement to development instead of a fundamental part of development. Coding schools. I have a question about coding schools because they're typically a 6 to 8, 28 week program where you're taking through many fundamental techniques of software development and languages. But a lot of the coding schools didn't list security on their curriculums, on their sites. And so my question is, are they teaching security? So that's something to think about. Another thing is that a lot of teams check for security after code development. So code is written, and then it's pen tested or scanned after the code is being written, which is a reactive versus a proactive approach. And I'll talk a bit more about that a little later. All right, so common misconceptions about security. Number one, security costs more, and it slows down software development and their time to market. I would say that fixing your reputation and having to deal with the loss of customer trust probably takes a lot more time and a lot more money. But I think that's still a very common misconception. So the same report that I referenced earlier found that 52% of developers said that they were worried that security would be an effect on their deadlines and their software development. So I do think it's still a huge misconception. I think a little less now because of all the headlines, but I think it still does happen a little. Another thing, I think security is a hard sell sometimes. It's seen as something that's needed once an issue arises, not before. It's like insurance. You don't actually think you need it until something actually happens. And so it can be a hard sell sometimes when resources are limited, especially. All right, so why is secure coding important? Well, number one, we are living in a hyper-connected world, one that is continuously being connected to the internet. We have more and more IoT devices every day. Your toaster's online, your fridge is online, everything is online. I work in the Department of Energy, so DOE. The energy grid is pretty high on my radar. And so there is an attack in 2015 in Ukraine that shows that an attack on this energy grid can be catastrophic at mass scale. I think 1,000 homes, thousands of homes were left without power for several hours. So I think that's proof that cyber attacks on the energy grid can be an issue. And then election security. There's been a lot of talk around security on voting and voting machines. And so I think that's something to think about too. And nation-state actors. There's an increasing threat from nation-state actors to use our vulnerabilities against us, right? And so I think it's still something we should keep talking about. All right, so looking ahead. So what is exciting in software security? I think there's a few things. I think to push the future of more secure software forward, I think the push for education will need to be number one, or at least high on the radar. I think more on the job security training, and then putting security as a requirement, or at least creating a program for undergrad programs and coding schools, I think is a way to go. I do think that bug bounties are really encouraging a lot of secure coding. I think Bugcrowd released a report that said that the payout right now is like over $6 million. So I think that's amazing. Machine learning and AI. I do think that there's great opportunities in security for machine learning and AI, because eventually we may have a tool that can proactively find vulnerabilities in software, and I think that that's a great help. And then DevSecOps. There's a lot of talk about DevSecOps right now, which is essentially the idea that security is baked into every part of your software development lifecycle, from start to finish. And there's a lot of resources on this. There's probably a lot of talk about it this week. So I definitely get involved with that if y'all are interested. And then here's some big questions that I have and I'd like to sort of pose to you all to think about. Number one, what responsibility do coding schools have in ensuring that their graduates are learning security? Like, is security part of development, or do you think it is a part something that's learned after you learn how to code? The second thing is, should developers have a universal code of ethics for software security? Right. So a lot of industries that do work that impact the public, they have licenses and they have a code of ethics, right? Doctors, but software developers don't, and so that's something I think we can think about. And then how much should our future consequences influence our present decisions in coding and software? So I think these are great questions to think about. All right, so I'll leave you all with this. This is kind of my last takeaway. There are 14,600 vulnerabilities that were submitted according to CVE, the CVE details site in 2017, versus 2016, the amount was 6,447. So I think that probably suggests there's a growing amount of vulnerabilities, or at least more people submitting them. Take that as you will. And then my last thought, we are deploying software right now that makes very important decisions on our lives, sometimes life and death decisions. We will have to think of new ways to ensure that it is secure going forward, and we will have to start thinking about securing our future right now. Thank you all.
I was about to start talking without the mic. None of you would have heard anything. Next up, we're going to have Ryan Wanstreet, who is a PhD student at the University of Washington. Although this is just the most recent in many of her lives, they have given her kind of a wealth of experience to draw from. Previously, she was in the Peace Corps. She was a project coordinator at the Center for Media and Data Studies at Central European University. And she worked in many leadership positions at Access Now, which is my employer and where I got to know Ryan and her wonderful work. Ryan?
Thank you. Oh, that's not the first slide. There we go. Hi. Thank you for having me. Are you having trouble? That's the question a John Deere rep asked a man named Chuck Biebermeyer when they called him during a sleet storm. He had been out plowing his fields, and he had noticed that he was having a little trouble getting through the earth. It seemed like his engine just wasn't getting as much power as it should be. And that turned out to be exactly what the problem was. Deere's sensors had registered that there was some kind of problem with the air intake. And so for his safety, Deere had actually started to throttle his engine. And so that kind of took Chuck by surprise, right? He was a little freaked out. But I tell this story because it's actually really emblematic of how very carefully many machines are being controlled and monitored on our farms now. So that tractor is part of precision agriculture, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. What it is, how prevalent it is, some of the problems with it, and how people are starting to deal with these problems. This is a really basic overview, but very simply, precision agriculture is when farmers can take data from historical records, from satellite images, from sensors that are all over their farms to create what's called prescriptions. And these prescriptions can tell the farmer or the farmer's machines themselves things like where to plant, how deep a seed should go, how much fertilizer to put in places, how much phosphorus to use. And that precision agriculture is being marketed as being more sustainable and cost-effective, more efficient. And there's some evidence that this is true. So farmers that are utilizing these tools are saying, yes, we're using less water, right? And of course, if you're using robots, ostensibly you have less labor costs. And I do have to say that there is a lot of cool robots that are being developed in this space. And I wanted to show you a couple. So on the top well, in the top, is a driverless tractor by John Deere. And that's actually the least cool thing on this space, or on this slide, because there's a ton of automated tractors right now. John Deere, as of a year or two ago, was actually the largest purveyor of automated vehicles on the planet. They were way ahead in this space, way ahead of Waymo, way ahead of Google. On the other top, my left, your right probably, is a strawberry picker. Fruit and vegetable bots are becoming incredibly common very quickly, and that's largely led by labor needs. On the bottom left is Prospero bots, and these work together like in an ant colony to deal with individual seeds and plants. And then this is the Hortobot. That's my favorite. The Hortobot seeks out individual weeds. I think it can directly spray herbicide, but it's also equipped with a little something extra. It's actually got some lasers and a flamethrower, because I guess some weeds are extra tenacious or something. What could possibly go wrong with that? So behind the growth of precision agriculture is a fact you will hear over and over again in every article that you read. We're going to have 9.5 billion people we're going to have to feed by 2050. And if I had more time, I'd go into some of the problems with that hyperbole, but it is true, we have a very growing population. And alongside of that is a growing precision agriculture market. So in 2016, the market was ostensibly around $3 billion. And a very low-ball estimate of what it might be worth in 2021 is around $19 billion. And that's why so many people are eager to get into it. So you have players that names you'll recognize that have always been part of the farming community, like John Deere and Monsanto. They bet very early and very heavily in data analytics. Then you have new entrants like Microsoft and IBM. And then you have venture capitalists, many of whom are very involved in the technical industry, like Google Ventures. And this is a global phenomenon, right? So although North America has about 50% of the market share, the places that are will likely see the largest amounts of growth in the next 5 years are places like Asia Pacific, Brazil. So that's kind of a very broad overview, right? This new technology, big data, is on track for this fourth agricultural revolution. It's going to save the world from famine. And by the way, a lot of people are going to make a lot of money. What could possibly go wrong with all of this? Well, it's not going to surprise you that there are things that could possibly go wrong with this. So there's two big issues that you consistently hear folks talk about as their biggest concerns, although there are a host of other concerns that we could talk about. Data and cybersecurity. So in the data realm, none of this is going to be new to this crowd. People are concerned about who owns it, who controls it, how is it being stored. Farmers really want to know, how could this data possibly be used against me? Could the government get access to it? Could my landlords get access to it? Could it be possible for my neighbors to see it? I personally am really curious about who's writing the algorithms that are behind these prescriptions. And farmers really want to know, why should someone else be making money off of the data that I'm generating? So in the cybersecurity realm, this is the Internet of Things. It's smart devices. It's a problem, right? Farmers are they're worried they're going to walk outside and their tractor is going to be bricked. I have a slightly larger concern. I worry that somebody is going to go after an entire network. So what would happen if some malicious state actor decided that they wanted to hack John Deere's network of tractors or go after Monsanto's platform? Could they actually bring down part of America's annual harvest? I know that sounds kind of crazy, right? But the FBI is actually really concerned about the growth of these technologies in agriculture. So in 2016, they sent out this bulletin. And they were like, farmers, we're really excited that you're engaging in these new technologies. We think it's a really great way to make your production more efficient. But by the way, you're probably making yourself really vulnerable to ransomware. And BT dubs, if you're using GMOs, you should probably know that hacktivists might come after you. And some companies have actually already been hacked. So Climate Corporation, which is a subsidiary of Monsanto, has already been breached. So big data, cybersecurity, those are the two like biggies, right? So how are people starting to deal with this? Well, it's not going to surprise anyone that the open source community, which is very vibrant in the agricultural sector, thinks that the correct solution is to move everything away from the proprietary platforms. So they're developing open source software, open source tools. One of the biggest problems with that is scale. And that's actually quite literal when it comes to tools. The open source tractors, for example, they're developing won't work on America's large farms. There's also quite a bit of data in initiatives. So a couple years ago already, the American Farm Bureau created a set of data principles that dealt with portability and ownership. But to be honest, they're kind of squishy. They don't really put the farmer first. And it's a little easy, for example, for corporations to sell the data of their consumers to third-party contractors. And that's probably why you're getting so many other like nonprofits and coalitions and platform co-ops that are trying to create neutral bodies outside of the proprietary systems, that they want to create their own like safe spaces almost. And you also have some commercial entities that are being developed, that they're billing themselves as like farmer-forward and data-centric spaces. Some of them are even figuring out ways to like allow farmers to sell their data to analytical companies. And that's an innovation that farmers are very, very excited about. So in the government sector, there's a move to push Congress to classify agricultural data in the same way that medical data is treated. And there is at least one working group that's working with different groups within government sectors to deal with the larger cybersecurity questions. Now, this is probably the very broadest overview of a huge sector that you could possibly get. And you've noticed that it is most heavily US focused, even though this is a global phenomenon. But I want to leave you with one final thought in my 30 seconds. The issues we talk about today and on Twitter, surveillance capitalism, surveillance platforms, the problems with the Internet of Things, problems with consolidations of corporations, these things are becoming as prevalent on farms as they are already on our phones. Now, farmers really do want to participate in this new technological and data ecosystem. They recognize the benefit that they can get from it, but they want to do it in a way that will allow them to maintain their agency and independence. And I think that that's still possible. There are really neat and innovative alternatives that are being developed. But they need to be supported today because this sector is moving so fast that if they're not bolstered right now, that those options won't be available tomorrow. So thank you.
And now we're going to bring it all home. Our final speaker for this session, before we go to panel, is Anna Lauren Hoffman, who is an assistant professor with the Information School at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her work sits at the intersections of data, technology, culture, and ethics, a fact that I found maybe best exemplified by the fact that her bio simultaneously quotes John Rawls and Janelle Monáe. Anna?
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Lauren Hoffman, and I am an edge case. I am a fraud. I am a weapon. Or at least that's what certain systems have said about me, to me. And by systems, I mean combinations of hardware, software, and people that serve to evaluate, assess, and secure particular environments. And I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about security in a broader sense, And I want to talk about the assumptions and normative ideals that we build into systems when we're trying to prevent fraud, when we're trying to improve security in certain contexts. And this work is situated in the area of applied ethics and technology. And like all applied ethical areas, making decisions involves balancing a few different factors. Most salient among them are technical factors. We are at any given time bound by the limits of the tools we have in front of us, technically. Practical factors, deadlines are real, budgets are real. These things help inform and shape our decisions. And also moral factors, and by moral factors I mean the principles, values, and ideals that guide us in making decisions. But within each of these sort of corners of the triangle, there are also little negotiations that need to happen, choices that we make, assumptions in particular that we make about the world and who occupies it. So a few stories. People may be familiar with this image. It is the image of a human body outline that gets spit out by the little screen on the other side of that airport body scanner that you walk through. Now, these are controversial for many reasons, but I think it's worth revisiting what actually happens when you negotiate with one of these systems. A lot of people don't recognize that the TSA agent on the other side of that machine before you walk in, the TSA agent makes a visual assessment and decides whether or not you're a man or a woman and pushes a button, a pink or a blue button. I'm making that up. And why do they have to do that? Well, they need to do that so it tells the software inside the millimeter wave scanner what to emphasize and what to ignore. You don't want the underwire in every woman's bra setting the machine off, so you need to tell the software to ignore that. So there are a set of features and assumptions about what a typical woman's body is going to look like as they walk through this machine, or what a typical man's body is going to look like when they walk through this machine. And those assumptions get coded into the software that interprets the data from the millimeter wave scanner and makes it accessible to a human agent. So for trans women, this is a problem for a lot of different kinds of bodies, but for trans women in particular, transgender women, when they walk through the scanner, if they have not had certain surgeries, in particular on the lower half of their body, they're going to see something like they see on the left. They're going to see a big old red or yellow blotch. And their genitals are going to be labeled as a threat. That blotch is no different than the blotch that would show up on a shoulder, on an ankle, wherever else. Labeled as a threat and treated as such, to the point that it triggers a set of procedures that you can't get out of no matter how hard you beg, that I would argue rise to the level of state-sanctioned sexual assault. Dating websites. I don't mean to pick on any one particular company. This was just a case that was publicized by the trans feminine genderqueer activist Addison Rose Vincent in the Huffington Post. But it's not an uncommon experience. So what happens in particular dating apps is you have a set of gender options that you select when you sign up. Sometimes they are limited to very strict binaries. You can identify as a man or a woman. You can then say you're interested in men or women or both. And that's kind of the field of possibility. Now, different sites can get different levels of nuance here. But what happens in some of these cases is you have transgender women, straight transgender women, sign up for these sites, indicate their interest in men, and their profile starts showing up. And cisgender men look at the presentation of certain women, or in this case, somebody who clearly wanted to overcome the limitations of the site and let users know that they were trans. by doing that brilliant thing that users do, right? They find a way around the system. It's like, well, if this is going to be profile heavy and I don't have that many options, well, I'll just state it in my profile picture. In this case, the user, after a little while, started getting these automated messages that said, we've noticed some suspicious activity. You've been getting a lot of reports. Knock it off. Knock off your inappropriate behavior. OK. In this case, the user didn't know what they were doing that was entirely inappropriate, so they just kept going, and pretty soon they got locked out of their account. Was it the intention of the platform to lock this person out of the account? No. But did they arrange software and people in certain ways that produced a particular outcome? Yes. So what happens is they were relying on user reports. And a lot of people in this room already know that a flag is never just a flag. They were relying on user reports, and not only that, they had automated they had automated these messages, so there was no human reviewing the reports. You got X number, you got the email. You got X number of reports more, you got locked out. Whether it was their intention or not, the cumulative effect was to endorse the harmful stereotype, a stereotype that causes direct violence and harm, that trans women are somehow not real women, that they are fraudulent, they are deceptive. And here you had an outcome that not only played into that stereotype, but amplified it. This is my favorite one. It's a little more recent. There was a computer science researcher in North Carolina who was working on facial recognition technology, in particular for border security, with some funding from the government, from the Department of Defense. One day, a student brought it to this person's attention that there were all of these videos on YouTube of trans people sharing the stories of their transition in pictures. Now, for trans people that decide to undergo hormone therapy or other kinds of interventions, it can have a more or less drastic effect on your appearance. And there's a culture on YouTube of sharing these videos and of sharing people's journeys and stories to offer support. It's a way of community building. It's a way of sort of making connections with other trans folks. This computer scientist took one look at these videos and said, wow, what if a terrorist took hormones to trick a border camera and illegally access a country? Like, this is the literal quote, right? Like, what kind of harm can a terrorist do if they understand that taking this hormone can increase their chances of crossing over into a border that's protected by face recognition? That was the problem I was really investigating. Never mind the fact that there are trans people who cross borders all the time. They're not terrorists. Here you have a decision that's made in order to fuel security research into border security, that does the same thing, that similarly says and confirms the harmful cultural stereotype that trans women are somehow deceptive or fraudulent. Again, a stereotype that leads to direct violence and harm, murder. But more than those concrete outcomes, those concrete violent outcomes, I want you also to think about the kinds of anxiety that these choices, the kinds of anxieties that these design decisions make for particular communities. That violence doesn't only inhere in the abhorrent, doesn't only inhere in those sensationalized cases of direct harm, but it also inheres in that background knowledge, that constant thing in the back of your head when you belong to a vulnerable group or your identity is marginalized in some way, when you go to a system and you're just like, in the back of your head, you're just like, oh crap, is it going to fail me today? That when we distribute those vulnerabilities and anxieties unequally, we create and further broader injustices and unequal conditions in the world. So thank you for your time.
All right, we're now going to bring all of our speakers back up onto the stage, and we're going to have a panel session. It will be moderated by Kara Swisher, who is an American technology journalist, a woman who needs no introduction. She is also the founder of Recode. Can all of you come back up here?
Sound. All right, everybody sit down. It is a distinct honor and thrill for me to have an all-woman panel, which has never happened in my 110-year-old career. Seriously. So nice. I don't know what to do. I think I'll just stop right now and get off the stage. So I want to start. A lot of you talked about very different things. Your beginning was amazing. The weapon. Yeah. It's 100% true. I want to make two observations, and then I want to get into talking about ethics, because you all talked about very different things: robot farming, lack of ethical training, all kinds of things. But I want to read two things. One thing I want to make the observation that yesterday the Pulitzer Prize was won by Ronan Farrow in the New York Times, a set of women at the New York Times. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that the Me Too movement, these two stories were critically important to starting off this, were written by women and a gay man. There's no coincidence of why that was. And so I want you to think about that as we're talking about this. And then secondly, I posted a thing today. I'm writing an essay about last week's hearings, the Facebook hearings, where Mark Zuckerberg successfully wore a suit. I think that was his success. Okay. And I was thinking of this quote because I think about it, and I want to put this in the context of what we're going to be talking about. It's from The Great Gatsby. My son is reading it in high school right now, and so I got my high school copy out and started reading it. Of course, there's this famous quote from it. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money and their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they made. I think it's a really good quote for what's happening right now around security and ethics. And so let's start talking about that. I'd love to get each of you, and there's a lot of people here, to talk sort of briefly where you think we are in ethics, because I think that's, to me, what's been missing from the entire thing. And it is directly related to the lack of diversity and lack of different ideas within some of these companies. And so you all talked about government, but to me, it's the same idea of how people think about what they're doing. So I'd love to start with you, Jennifer. Just briefly, where you think we are.
I mean, I think there's this very one-sided, people can take this one-sided approach based on what's the, I mean, I thought you put this so well, like what's the question you're trying to investigate? And this, from my perspective, this overwhelming kind of focus on terrorism and crime as if those are the only interests and those interests reign supreme over everything. And I think you can see it, in Nikki's Facebook, I'm talking about your talk, but in Nikki's Facebook talk also, it's like when you're, you have what your goal is, and that goal can seem all-consuming, and then other goals and other important interests kind of fall by the wayside. And that's what I was trying to say about government hacking. It's like, okay, well, we're going to get this information, but these other important goals are so closely tied to it, and we're losing sight of that. And that's why we really need to have a conversation about the other interests that are connected to these efforts.
Right. Do you think it's a lack of thought or purposeful?
I think it's a combination, but I don't think it's. I don't think it's malicious. I think that it's, you work on what you get judged on. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a big surprise that law enforcement wants to catch criminals. Mm-hmm. But that's not the only interest at heart.
Yeah, not thoughtlessness per se, but lack of depth of thought. Mm-hmm. Let's put it that way. So one of the things I spent a lot of time thinking about discriminatory algorithms, thinking about sort of representation and harm through automated systems, and I find that the conversation has gotten so much better around impact. Like we've gotten so much better at talking about particular discriminatory outcomes of a given system, whether it's like in finance and determining whether somebody is a loan risk or not, or in the criminal justice system. We're good at talking about these impacts, but we're not yet quite to the point where we're questioning the assumptions that are informing our questions. We kind of have this libertarian-y, like intellectual freedom, a very acontextual version of intellectual freedom that's like, well, we shouldn't prevent us from asking questions.
Right.
Failing
Well,
to
I call
recognize
it libertarian light.
libertarian light. Yeah, this is good. And so not only so we haven't quite penetrated that like there are a set of assumptions about people, about bodies, about communities that are informing our questions, but yet we treat questions as kind of like this sacred domain, and we don't interrogate those assumptions that are fueling our questions in the first place.
Right.
I think part of it is we still have a deep belief in techno-utopianism. Like technology can solve all of our problems, right? I mentioned that you'll always hear this fact that oh, we all have 9.5 billion mouths to feed, and we have to deal with that. And there's a lot of problems with that fact in general. But if you talk to if you talk to providers in the space and people that are dealing in the space, they're like, that's why we have to keep pushing so hard. We don't, these are important questions you're asking, like, oh, cybersecurity is important, like privacy issues are important, but we don't have time to wait because we have to solve this problem. The fact is like 73% of our arable land it goes to ethanol and to cattle grazing. So there's other ways to deal with this problem too. But there's such a belief that like technology can solve every problem without changing any of the other multiple options that we have available to us that it kind of allows us to gloss over all the issues.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think with technology, and I'll talk a little bit about how what I talked about in my talk about the code of ethics. I think specifically in development, I think software development, I think people start talking about ethics when there's impact on or when dangerous things happen, or when you realize the impact of your decisions or your software can really, really do some harm. And I think that's when the ethics conversation happens. I think specifically in technology, it will happen. I think it's starting to happen now. But I think a lot of times when you're building software, even you don't know what people will use that software for sometimes. Like you have no idea how it can be weaponized sometimes until
Really?
it's
I'm sorry, I'm going to push back on that one because I think you do have a sense of how it can be weaponized if you use slight creativity in terms of.
But that requires diversity in order to
Right.
to
Well,
be able to
only
imagine
because
those things.
I mean, I've used this example many times. When I was at Facebook, when they had Facebook Live, they showed me an early example of it. And I was in the room and I said, well, what are you going to do about people who murder each other or beat each other up or commit suicide?
Right.
And literally to a person, I'm like, Kara, you're so negative. Yeah. and I was like, have you met the fucking human race? Because I feel like the history has been pretty tough.
Yeah.
And literally it was this sort of, how can you rain on our fantastic parade of mothers wearing Chewbacca masks? How can you do that? and it was, I find her menacing myself. But what was fascinating was the lack, we didn't know. I think that is just a canard. But go ahead, please proceed.
No, and I totally understand where you're coming from. I think it can be tough to imagine all the possibilities. I think sometimes it can be difficult to imagine all the possibilities of how a software can be used. And I think that goes back to my conversation of we do need to think about privacy and security in mind a lot as software is being developed. But I do think ethics comes into a conversation specifically in software when bad things happen. And I think it's still a conversation that's still being had.
I guess I would completely agree with you, Kara, that, we identified these threats. Like we identified these threats in 2009. We talked about the implications of the app gap. We talked about the implications of publicly available information. We talked about Google Street View when it was, these are not things that were unexpected. These were not things that couldn't have been addressed. There were very deliberate actions to prioritize growth and the bottom line over user privacy, over issues. So I thought, much of the testimony last week was, either somewhat misleading or disingenuous. I think that, ethics, I think the companies do what the companies are forced to do. I think that a lot, changes will probably happen with GDPR because they have to, and they're going to be hitting the bottom line if they don't do that. I think that things have certainly changed since I started doing this work in 2004, but some of it is that the companies have been pushed to for that change through FTC investigations or through law. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg talked a lot about changes that the company had made, but he didn't mention that the company made those changes because they were forced to by the consent decree, or forced to by the Canadian government, or forced to by, you know, the Illinois biometric law that they were then trying to gut. So, you know, I do think that, you know, I think that there are a lot of folks in companies who are committed to privacy and human rights, but I think that real change and fundamental privacy change happens when the companies are required to do so by law.
So let's talk about that. Let's use the Mark's testimony last week to talk about that, because it does extend to the government and everything else. I'd love to get your assessment of what you think happened. I was struck myself by the obsession of terms of service by the legislators, because it's a very easy thing and really not the point. I felt like it was not the point whatsoever, but they enjoyed saying your terms of service suck. And then we go back to business as usual, essentially. So I'd love to get just an idea, and even going to, of what you think that represented, because he's very representative of Silicon Valley, I think, in terms of mentality. And to be fair, they have been trying to make changes now, forced to, because of it. So anyone thoughts on what happened last week?
Speaking to the ethics piece, and to tie this question with the previous conversation a little bit, you know, these kinds of controversies as drivers of change, these kinds of we think about ethics when bad things happen, as Ashley put it, right? Is another dimension that I just kind of want to insert this before we talk about Mark, is that these things do fuel change, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that it is constantly the same communities who are having to raise that issue, right? Like, it's not, we're not fueling change sort of because we're all equally beta testers in the wild. No, it's trans folks, it's communities of color, it's disabled people, and it's these people who are constantly having to come forward and identify the shortcomings of systems and fight to be seen, or fight to be accommodated, and so, well, this is a driver. It's obviously woefully insufficient because...
I agree with you. That, to me, was what I saw last week, was not someone who was self-aware in any way of the problem, but just kept repeating, you know, we have a broader responsibility with that one. I drank every time he said that. And it was interesting because it began last year with, what are you talking about? We had no responsibility. And then it slow rolled to, okay, maybe a tiny bit. And then it was... even as of 2 weeks ago, when I did an interview with him where he said, I don't want to make decisions from my desk in California, if you remember that quote. Like, I don't want to make decisions about this platform. And I was like, well, you built it. And he goes, yeah, but I don't want to make decisions about it. And I go, but you built it, Dr. Frankenstein. Like, and the monster's making some trouble, you know, for the rest of the country. And so it was an interesting thing. And then to the hearings 2 weeks later where it's, oh, it is my responsibility. So you're right. That's 100% true. But
I mean, I'm more skeptical of the ability to fix this problem through rules. I think there are clearly problems we can fix through rules, but you know, there are, and I think this is why we have so much focus on terms of service, is because for a long, long time in the privacy world, our solution has been notice and consent. That's been our framework for a long time. And you know, notice and consent doesn't work. Like, nobody's actually surprised about that. People don't read them, you know, what are they really agreeing to? They can't project what's going to happen. It disadvantages some people. If everybody else agrees, then the platform works for these people, but it doesn't work for these people. It doesn't work for a variety of reasons. But then what do? What's the answer? And that answer is hard because there are trade-offs. There's trade-offs on data portability and competitiveness for other companies that want to take advantage of Facebook data where the users like it. There's trade-offs on the cost of regulation and whether smaller companies will ever be able to comply and actually ever grow up to be able to compete with the Facebooks and the Gmails and the Twitters of the world. I could go on, but I think, you know, we are seeing the GDPR. GDPR is a set of trade-offs that was basically made because Europe doesn't really give a shit about the American internet industry. And so we're going to see what that is going to, you know, wreak here. We already have the right to be forgotten problem, which is combating directly with our First Amendment and freedom of expression. So, you know, we're in the complicated trade-off stage, and I think that it's going to be hard, and we're going to lose stuff. And the question is, which are we going to lose? And I think that's why people focus on the wrong thing. It's because it's an easy answer to a very hard problem.
If only we could read this, we'd understand.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I guess I have a slightly different perspective because I'm coming from a different population. In some ways, I thought it was great because, man, they showed that everywhere. Like every TV channel and every public place showed those hearings, and how often does that happen?
Right.
One of the, this data in agriculture is not, it's not new. They've started to implement this over the case of the past, the past 5, 7, 8 years. And one of the things that apparently really surprised these, like Monsanto and Deere, although why it surprised Monsanto, I don't know, was the fact that farmers wanted to know what was happening to their data. They were shocked that they weren't just implicitly trusted. So there was already sort of a questioning that was happening, which is why you're having these neutral bodies and like these alternative commercial platforms being developed. So at least in sectors that aren't saturated already, you're starting to see these alternatives that are being developed and these policies that are being created that are forming partially because of the distrust and some of the problems that you've seen in like social media companies. And so the more that you see Facebook kind of struggle to answer basic questions, the more I think you'll see advances in sectors that aren't as developed.
Such as this. I'm shocked that Monsanto thought it would be trusted, but okay.
I was shocked that they just had it implicit. Like but I'm from Missouri, so I mean, having Monsanto as a neighbor has given me kind of an implicit like distrust. So.
Yeah. So, so when you think about the impact of that, because I do want to get to the government stuff, do you imagine when you say that it does have an impact, or where does the impact go after this week? From the hearings, yeah.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure.
Oh, yeah.
Where does the impact go? I mean, I do think that it was very useful to have these conversations. I mean, I think that we have been waiting for these conversations for about a decade and trying to get sort of widespread discussion about the fact that, people aren't in a position to necessarily understand these things. We saw the members of Congress really having very little understanding of how Facebook actually works. And to me,
that's a very low bar. But
but the reality is that members of Congress aren't so different from the general public. And so the concept that technology has advanced exponentially, and we really haven't had any advances in privacy law for 20, 30, 40 years. It is an industry where in other places where there is information asymmetry, where things are hard to understand, where you overestimate the risk and you underestimate the potential harm, that law and policy does step in to create protections for people, in the automobile industry, in the healthcare industry. So, that has, where do we go from here? I think that we actually need real steps to be taken, because what I have seen is, the companies do, 1 step forward and 3/4 of a step back. And it's this dance. When something bad happens, there's some reaction, but the fundamental issues don't get addressed.
I was really struck by how many politicians said, "How would you like to be regulated, Mr. Zuckerberg?" That was really interesting to me. I was like, what? Like, it was an interesting thing to say publicly.
But we know that there's often a lot of, heat in DC. But I think one of the Republicans said, we either overreact or we do nothing. And like, being here in California is a place where we really have sort of moved the ball forward in terms of consumer privacy in a lot of different ways. I mean, we wouldn't have privacy policies if it weren't for the California Online Privacy Protection Act. We wouldn't know about data breaches if there wasn't the California data breach law. So, and it's because California has a constitutional right to privacy that's broader than the Fourth Amendment, that applies to private parties.
I want to talk in the time about where the solutions come from, not just with privacy, but security too. Because, one of the things that wasn't discussed very much, for some reason I'm not getting, was Russia, what happened on the platform. There were very few questions about Cambridge Analytica. It was quite small compared to the obsession with the terms of service. But where does it come from? So let's talk about where it comes from. Then, do we want it to come from a government which we have just discussed, which you have all just discussed, has a problem with its own, which I think it was inherent incentivized attackers, where the government themselves are the ones attacking and using this data. So let's talk about where it comes from right now, and then discuss how we can trust a government to make regulatory policy when it itself has an incentive to attack the population. And I'm just talking about here. It's happening all over the world elsewhere. So where do you imagine? So you think California or states, from the states?
Well, I think that's one option. I mean, I think it's where we do see movement quite a bit. So, I would be surprised if we don't see some states moving on some of these issues, but I think there's a lot of discussion about what potentially can happen, in Congress. I know there's a lot of conversation about, you can have laws, but if you don't have strong enforcement mechanisms, what kind of power, the FTC and other agencies have. So there's a lot of conversations. I mean, there's a lot broken, which is how we are in this space right now.
All right, where else do we think that's going to happen, these kind of protections?
So I think going a little bit back to the last conversation, I think one thing the impact of last week impacted is the need for technologists and legislation. And I think that is a great place to start, because I definitely think there needs to be some type of technical informing on these legislative issues. And I think that's definitely an answer. And there was a lot of talk about that after it happened. So.
Right. Well, that they're not in the room when they're making these things. They're absolutely not. They're seen as a second tier. That was obvious from the hearings. But there wasn't a lot of technological expertise.
Exactly. So that was one of the first thoughts I had. So
and then where does that come from then? From training by these companies in their self-interest to do so, or from the universities? From where? Because you were talking about the idea of getting ethical guidelines related to security and privacy within the training, which does not exist as far as I can tell.
Does not. Yeah.
So where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a good question.
There are some organizations like Tech Congress, which is making.
And Travis is here.
Travis is right over here. So good line of sight, Travis. Very which are basically helping to put technologists in as staffers in congressional offices, and that's one way you can kind of see the effect of that when you have senators who are asking questions, who have somebody who understands the technology there to explain things before them and help them sort of get up to speed and do their homework.
And what about
certainly universities? I came from Stanford, so I think universities are important. Maybe that's self-importance of academics, but I think that's another way too. And I mean, technology companies are very rich and they have lots of lobbying ability. They can also help serve an educational role, even if it's somewhat self-interested.
But I just want to sort of push back on that a little bit, because there is a lot of technological knowledge that gets sort of brought to Congress or to legislators on issues, and it's good bills get drafted and good ideas are put forward, and usually it's decimated by lobbying from the industry side. So there's sort of this idea that, legislators don't know enough to create rules and laws for the internet. But in my experience in 15 years working on these issues, that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is that the industry doesn't want any regulation, and they muck it up in the system so it looks like nobody knows what they're doing.
And law enforcement doesn't want to
does the same
accept any
thing.
advances in privacy.
So there's a complete no, and the process of, and there's a good storyline saying, well, look at this mess of a bill, legislators don't know what they're doing, and that actually isn't what's happened behind the scenes.
Right, I do think it takes responsibility away from them to actually do something. And I think, to me, last week was, he looked reasonable and so sorry again. And he wore a suit and he didn't sweat. And he wasn't an asshole like Bill Gates was when he went up there. And therefore, he's a nice boy kind of thing, that drives me nuts. But so it seems like he's an adult, he has children. Stop it, stop calling him a boy. So I don't feel like there's going to be any movement at all whatsoever, except if Facebook decides to do it themselves, from my perspective. But.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's, to come back to the role of universities and researchers, one of the outcomes of this now is that the Social Science Research Network has arranged with Facebook, researchers, independent researchers will get access to certain kinds of data. There are a lot of questions remaining about what kind of data and when and how that gets vetted. But that kind of independent oversight will be useful. I think the key takeaway here, though, is that there's never going to be like one knockdown solution, especially to infrastructures this big and this powerful. You need the government as much as like my skin crawls to say that as somebody who like has to deal with the TSA and airports. Be like, we need the government to get involved, but you also need like power, like existing counter levers to the power of some of these companies. That's one source that's powerful enough.
That usually is the counter level with automobiles, with finance.
Absolutely, right. And so it's going to be a bunch of these things coming together. And and the thing that I often point to, and we don't think about these as tech ethics issues, we don't think about these as security ethics issues, but another thing that we need to focus on, and it's deeply unsatisfying, is just making the lives of vulnerable people less contingent on the decisions of these technologists, on the decisions of these people. So like access to healthcare and anti-poverty are tech issues, right? And we don't fold those in, we don't think about those, and it suddenly makes the problem seem really like big and intractable. But really the end game for me is making vulnerable communities less vulnerable to the decisions of Mark or other at all.
Do you imagine that? How does that happen?
Well, it doesn't happen now.
Right.
Right. That's the other thing, is that I think there are different timelines of change that are important to grapple with here.
So you were talking about the government being one of those solutions, but as you said, the government is advantaged by all this information and uses it in some way. It used to feel like that was the case. In this case, it feels perhaps not so much.
Oh, I mean, that information is available to the government, often without any real legal process. And not just to our government, but increasingly to other governments around the world. And I totally get and agree with what you're saying on the one hand, but I think on the other hand, we have this kind of, in the United States at least, we have this schizophrenia. We want the government to get involved and solve the problem of like big platforms when it comes to privacy, but the government wants to come in and solve the problem of big platforms when it comes to spying on people and speech. And here in the United States, we're like, well, people should be allowed to say and express what they want to say and express within, certain realms. And our realm is quite large, but in Europe and in other democracies, they don't have that same value placed on freedom of expression. And, for me, the thing that made me fall in love with the internet was that ability to say what you wanted. It was, the line from the Hacker Manifesto. You're judged on the content of your mind and not based on your appearance or where you come or from or your religion or anything. And that idea, I mean, to me, I'm still in love with that idea. But the more you ask like the government to fix it or even to ask platforms to fix it, that value is put at risk. And it is very hard to do both those things.
So where does it come from each of you? And then I'd like to end by asking, let's pick someone who's heavy in the idea that we need to have more surveillance because they're out to get us. Actually, they got us without the surveillance. It's kind of interesting to think about. Like, say you're Dick Cheney. All right, let's all be Dick Cheney for a moment.
That is dark, Kara.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to the darkest person I can think of who's actually intelligent. So I can think of a lot of dark, dumb people. What is the argument for the government being able to do these things? Is there one?
Do which things?
This surveillance. Because that's what they use. They use this idea of we're going to be attacked. Well, we got attacked.
Well, the government does surveillance. The government can do a defense amount. The question is with what safeguards?
Yeah.
I mean, there's very little scenarios where you just say to the government, sorry, you're out of luck and you have no other options. Especially today where there's so much data around. The question is, what limits do we place on that and what does the public get to know about it so that when things go wrong, we can make changes and fix it?
Dick Cheney? Anybody?
Where's Dick Cheney?
You don't want to make it
well, so the point I was trying to make is that in the near term, like the kinds of counter pressures that are powerful enough are going to be the government, and it's exactly this thought experiment that makes that so deeply unsettling.
Yes, exactly.
In the long term, right? Yeah.
So if you could pick one thing that has to change in this, one law that has to be passed, one thing, each of you, I'd love to hear what you think it should be. Let's start at the end and finish. About a minute.
Well, I mean, years ago, I really talked about the Cambridge Analytica just validates to me that in order for there to be change, people actually have to know what's happening. And so years ago, following sort of the Facebook quiz about Facebook quizzes, we introduced the California Right to Know Act, which would have given individuals the right to know what information was collected about them and how it was shared, not just sold, but how it was shared with third-party apps, whatever. And to me, that forms, it doesn't give control, but it forms the foundation for people knowing the actual impact on them. Because when it's personal, people understand the harm. When it is in the future, they don't. And so it's not going to solve it, but I do think that real transparency and control is absolutely essential. And as I said, I think having information that has no controls, publicly available information that users can't control in any way, is really detrimental both for consumer privacy and government surveillance.
Okay, Nick?
Yeah, I think GDPR is going to have a lot of impact on where we're going, because a big part of it is that you cannot assume consent from someone. I think that's pretty important, because I think a lot of times, a lot of consumers, you have no idea where your data is going once it's on the internet. When you want privacy in your home, you close the door, but when you want privacy online, you have no idea what that even means anymore. And so I think we're going to have to learn a lot from GDPR.
Okay.
So I have three things that kind of connect in my mind, at least. First of all the things that I talked about potentially being able to be hacked in the US, all of those things can be done on reverse, right? So the US could decide to do this against Russia, Ghana could do it against whatever. And I think one of the worries that I have about over-regulation is that could actually consolidate control in lesser and lesser corporations and make it harder for newer entrants to come on the market. So if I were going to say that I want changes in legislation, I would actually say that there would be mechanisms to help bolster newer entrants, whether that's to support platform cooperatives, whether that's to support nonprofits, so less regulate. I mean, I know that they need to be regulated, but I don't want to make it harder for new entrants to become part of that, because I think that the diversity in this ecosystem is one of the most important things that we can support.
Yeah, and I think what's astonishing is it's not, when they were asking about the monopoly, I was like, no, it's scarier than that. There's too many of them. So he does have competitors, but they're all just astonishingly powerful when they're arrayed in front of, between Google, Amazon, Facebook, and
Five,
yeah.
As one piece of the puzzle, and it's not a knockout solution, but as one piece of the puzzle, I would like more rooms where future computer scientists are captive and I get to yell at them. So I think there's a role for education to play. And I think there's a role for scholars like me and researchers like me who study social and ethical dimensions of technology to have more exposure to future technologists.
How many can you yell at a day?
Oh, I mean, with technology.
With funding.
I'm just curious if you feel like it's gold, because I do, and I enjoy it quite a bit.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah, although my children are better behaved than some of these people. Go ahead.
Three things: right to encrypt, limitations on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act so that outside investigators can figure out what these algorithms and platforms are really doing, and the Email Privacy Act. If you want our content, you go get a warrant.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.